Albert Travers explanation. Albert Travers was a stout man, and he very much appeared as a blacksmith might appear, as brawny and with black hair and a stout nose, though it wasn't large. Neefus, on the other hand, tall and somewhat lanky, his nose small and pointed, though his hair did match, was somebody of lesser stature, one could say. It was a common thing for the townsfolk of this particular village, and in fact for the people of most of the country, to have black hair, in fact. Black hair and bright blue eyes, most of them, with some blondes and a few redheads mixed in, but no matter. Neefus knew why he was here, to speak with Albert, to hear his side of the story and of his wife's death, which Neefus had obviously neglected to inquire over, which he'd been next to her, when he'd been next to her as she died, something he would lament, except, well, he simply couldn't bring himself to care so much about it, he supposed. Nonetheless, he continued. "Albert," he said, "it's been a while." Albert, as he opened the door for Neefus, did smile, or rather he would have if the frown on his face could have moved up any further, but it simply stayed there, seemingly seamlessly, forced down by something heavier, perhaps, than gravity itself. Neefus pondered to himself before asking the question. "How are you doing, Albert?" Albert nodded twice, and then after having made his peace, or so it seemed that way, Albert decided to tell Neefus of his troubles, of the death of his poor wife, who had too untimely passed. "It was a terrible thing," he began with tears in his eye. "Your wife," Neefus nodded, putting himself more seriously. "Yes," he said, "yes." Neefus nodded, feigning concern and interest. "Perhaps you'll tell me of it in your lounge as we sit." He nodded, wiping his eyes clean. "Yes, that is a good idea." In a short moment they were inside of the lounge, and there they sat between a large oaken coffee table on two large and furnished chairs, which were green and red respectively. Of course, these only helped to procure the conversation into that which it might become, to aid in the man, Albert Travers, telling Neefus of, he hoped, all or most of what he knew that he had passed therein on the town street. In but a moment this conversation began. "I hope," Albert said, "that my appearance in this moment does not offend you." Neefus had forgotten. For a blacksmith, he spoke rather properly, something he had picked up undoubtedly from years of experience with the finest and wealthiest of hands in the lands in the country. Perhaps not something that he was born with, Neefus thought, and he could tell after a few sentences that his speech wasn't quite inbred. "Of course, no," Neefus said, a faint smile on his face, a look of reassurance he hoped to Albert, who presumably had loved his wife. And in fact he did, and in but moments Albert was telling Neefus about all the times that he had enjoyed alongside his wife, tears streaming down his eyes, until finally he fell upon himself in weeping and buried his lap into his large smith hands. In fact, he was so overtaken with grief that Neefus found it with ease that he would and did tell him of his wife's passing, or all that he knew of it. Neefus, Albert, was actually the one who prompted the conversation after finally ceasing to weep. "Do you know anything that you could tell me of my wife and her death?" Neefus shook his head. Had he known he was there? No, surely he hadn't. Neefus spoke. "Of course, I know nothing, Albert," Neefus said, feigning grief. "I only heard about it from the lady of the post, but a little time ago. He said cautiously, "I was hoping that you might tell me." "Me?" Albert said, somewhat surprised. "I don't have anything, Neefus. I don't know anything." Neefus sat up straight, touching his chin and nodding. "Okay," he said, "I see." "I heard that you were there," Albert said more seriously. Neefus said, perking his head up and looking straight at Albert. "Me?" "Someone saw you," he stated plainly. Neefus shook his head and remained calm. I wasn't actually." "Then why did I hear that you were?" Albert had his eyes locked on Neefus. Neefus thought a moment before answering. "I did go to the office of the post, perhaps." He paused a moment, still touching his chin and then raising up his nose and tilting his head back. "Perhaps someone saw me there." "Yeah." "That is where she died," Albert said, nodding and looking down at his hands again with a small breath. "That makes a lot more sense." Yes, Neefus said, noting Albert's change in emotion. Did you think that I had something to do with it? Albert shook his head. No, Neefus, not you. It's been a hard day, Neefus stated. Albert nodded. They were not good friends, yet Neefus felt as if Albert thought of him in this way, or close enough as such. He would use this, he thought. Tell me, Albert, he said. You're a good friend of mine. I wonder, do you know anything of what killed her? Neefus didn't even remember her name in that moment, though it was Mary. Albert shook his head, another tear swelling in his eye. I know bits and pieces, Neefus. Bits and pieces, Neefus said, pretending to think. Tell me what you know, Albert. Albert shrugged defensively. I'm not sure why you'd want to know, Neefus. I don't, Neefus said, maintaining his calm demeanor, except to try to understand what happened. Albert eyed him a moment, but Neefus maintained his position, and after a rate, Albert did say, a look of contempt in his eyes, though not directed at Neefus. Yes, I think that is a good idea, Neefus. You've always been quite intelligent. Neefus nodded. Tell me then, Albert. Tell me what you know of your wife's death.